Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. This time I'm rerunning a podcast I've appeared on from the wonderful Lib Dem Pod team, who did a special interview episode with myself, Mike Dixon, the Liberal Democrat Chief Executive, and Ed Davey, our party leader. So over to Hannah and the Lib Dem Pod team.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Lib Dem podcast. My name is Hannah Kitching and I am hosting the podcast today, which is a Q&A with three top people in our party, some might say. I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves in a moment. This is our first podcast back of 2022, so Happy New Year, everyone. If you could I'd like to just introduce yourselves, please, guys, and then just give me a really quick kind of summary of what your role in the party is. So we'll start with Mark, please.
Hi, Hannah. Nice to join you. I'm Mark. I am the president of the Liberal Democrats, which means I was elected by all party members a couple of years back for a 3-year term. And my job technically is chairing the federal board. But I think in practice, the key thing is that by being someone who's elected by all party members, I try and make sure we always remember and bring the voice of party members to key decisions that are being made.
Lovely. Thanks, Mark. And then we'll go to Ed.
Happy New Year, everybody. I'm Ed. I'm the leader of the party. I guess that means I lead the politics and the political campaigning and messaging, working with my parliamentary team here in the Commons, but also the Lords, local government, and the wider membership, and of course, every one of you. We've got to get that politics right, and it's my job to work with you to get that right.
Lovely. Thanks, Ed. And then Mike.
Hello, I'm Mike. So I'm appointed to the role through an interview process, appointed by the federal board, and my job is to manage the people and the money in a more formal way.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so as I said, first podcast of 2022. Let's have a quick review of the year. So we'll go back the way around. So we'll start with Mike first. What is your assessment of how the Lib Dems did in 2021?
Really well, I think. So we had 2 fantastic by-election wins. And I think as importantly underneath, we built a lot of the systems, the processes, the ways of working that Dorothy recommended in her Thornhill review. So it feels like we're working much better as one party. We're doing things more collaboratively. We've got much stronger teams in place. And I think we're pretty well set for the next year. So I was really pleased with, from an operational kind of chief exec point of view, how well the party's running at the moment. Still a lot to do, but definitely huge strides forward.
Brilliant. That's really good to hear, Mike. And I think Ed's going to tell us how that kind of operational smoothness is translated into political success. What would you say, Ed?
Yeah, well, of course, the stunning by-election wins in Cheshire, Amersham and North Shropshire were obviously the highlights, but they were part of the wider picture that Mike's just described. I think, though, for the Liberal Democrats, they've helped change the narrative about us and the wider political narrative. We've shown that the Tories can be beaten and that the Liberal Democrats are able to take seats from the Tories like no one else. I think we're offering a political home for thousands of former Tory supporters, decent people, absolutely dismayed by Boris Johnson's leadership. And overall, I think it shows that we're back with our campaigning mojo. And I'd like to think so many people in the party, decisions by the federal board, implemented by Mike and Mark and the whole team, particularly focusing on rebuilding our field campaigns team. They're the staff, the amazing people who help organise victories like Cheshire, Amersham and North Shropshire and have put a smile back on our faces.
Yes, it is good to start the new year with a smile, isn't it, Ed? Mark, what about you? What's your appraisal of 2021 for the Lib Dems?
Yeah. I think the second half of the year was just way beyond any even exaggeratedly optimistic expectations we would have dared have a year ago. You know, to win 2 parliamentary by-elections in a year off the Tory, something we've not done since. I shudder to think what proportion of the party members were not even born when we, last achieved that in 93, and to be, solidly up in the opinion polls, about 3 points on average across the year is really good news. I think the challenge for us looking forward now to next year is to expand that success. That, colleagues in Scotland, say, who are listening to this will doubtless be remembering that, in Scotland, sadly, we didn't manage to go forward in a number of MSPs. And in Wales, we held on to our one Senedd member, but unfortunately weren't able to grow that this time. That we've made really good successes in the second half of the year. Then the big challenge now is to replicate that on a wider scale in the really important elections coming up in May.
So let's just pick up on North Shropshire, because obviously that's really fresh in people's memory. So what was your, because I think it's fair to say these by-elections, they weren't sitting ducks, were they? They weren't kind of top of the Lib Dem hit list. So I'd love to know, what was your kind of honest gut reaction when someone came to you and said, because I know the campaigns team did some sort of preliminary door knocking, finding out what things were like on the ground. When whoever that person was that came to you guys and went, let's go for it, what was your gut reaction, Ed?
Definitely. I've been around the party a long time, and I remember when we did win lots of by-elections that no one thought we could win. Mark mentioned back in 1993 when we won Christchurch and Newbury, and I had a sense that the tide is turning against the Tories, the tide is turning against Boris Johnson, with the endless scandals and the sleaze, and frankly their shocking management of the country, whether it's the economy, whether it's pandemic. I think lots of people are fed up. They feel taken for granted, and especially in the blue wall seats, our core opportunity where we can turn those blue wall seats yellow. I think voters are genuinely fed up of being taken for granted, ignored, frankly taken advantage of. So I think when they came to me and said we could win this, I said, yeah, let's go for it. I'm really up for it. And I actually really enjoyed getting on the doorstep and talking to people and seeing how many Tory voters were disillusioned and saw us as the best opportunity.
What about you, Mike? Because obviously one thing we know is that by-elections cost money, significant amounts of money. So what was your fresh off the back of Chesham and Amersham, where I'm presuming we spent some pennies? What was your reaction when they said we're going for another one?
I mean, the way your question is phrased, it makes it sound like HQ is a huge army of people, and actually it's a really small team in the centre of the party. So I think about, after the by-election was called, I think about 6 of us went up. I was really keen to be part of that because I hadn't done it for Chesham and Amersham, and I wanted to see on the ground how are the campaigns team making that decision. So I think we talked to about 300 people that day, tried to talk to 1 or 2 people on every kind of street, and it was really clear that people were unhappy, and that there were some specific things that were very campaignable on. So NHS, hospitals. It was also really clear that Brexit wasn't coming up as an issue that would have been a problem for us. And it felt like the kind of place that's been taken for granted. So, and then so we did that for a day. That evening, we all sat around in the place that later became our HQ around a table and just said, do we think we can really improve on second place? We'd also had dinner the night before with the local party, who had clearly done a lot of work setting up all the delivery routes, had managed to print out on a riso and get leaflets right across the constituency, and had the right attitude. So they said, we want to work with you as the federal party to really make this work. We want to learn from this, and we want to leave ourselves in a really good place. So I think it was that combination of voters who were open to us, the experience we'd had in Chesham and Amersham, and the result of the local party meant it was really obvious that we should go for it. It wasn't really even a decision that we had to make. And we thought the other thing that's important about that decision, I think, is you have to plan activity out quite a few, at least 2 weeks in advance. And so we need to release the funds for that. So effectively what we did was we said, let's release as much money as we can spend reasonably if we were going to do this at full tilt for the whole campaign, and after 2 weeks we'll take stock and pull back if we think it's not going well. And as it happened, it was going really well. And for everyone that contributed, I want to say a massive thank you, because people responded really well to the fundraising that we did throughout this. It meant that we could actually run the kind of campaign we wanted. So if you came, if you gave money, if you encouraged other people to come, if you called people, it was a really big effort across the party. So you did this. Thank you.
Mark, would you echo that?
Yeah, I think, when I first sort of saw that, by-election was, in the offing there, I sort of, grabbed my electoral statistics, had a look at the figures and thought, well, crikey, this is a Newbury type swing that we would need to win it. So I guess in theory it's possible, but is the politics really the same now for us and for the government as it was then? But I think, as Mike has touched on, in a way, the key decision isn't to think, have we got a chance of winning? It's more to think, the amount of information right at the beginning of a campaign, is it worth throwing everything at it and to see how it goes? And throwing everything at it might mean a good second place. It might mean being in with a chance of winning. And you actually don't know the difference between those two very often until quite deep into the campaign. And you can't leave, a bit like, I guess, what you need to do to be successful with a by-election is the opposite of Boris Johnson's approach to tackling COVID. You can't wait until you've got the hard data. You need to be thinking ahead. But the thing that really stuck in my mind was, having heard people like Mike enthuse about their early canvassing, was when I then went and did my first canvassing session. And everyone I spoke to was a soft Tory. And I said afterwards to others, look, if anyone else had done this, I wouldn't have believed it. I wouldn't have, surely if you're coming back and saying everyone is a soft Tory, you're canvassing badly, But so that for me was the moment I thought, yeah, okay, I really believe what others are saying. This is definitely, we've got to take the gamble and throw everything at it.
And I think that's something that was really important for members and viewers to see, was all of yourselves out there on the campaign trail, from early doors. I think particularly you, Mike, because I think, a lot of people, obviously it's Ed's job to be out there knocking on doors, but I think people perceive, the chief executive is more of a desk job. And I think it's been really fantastic for the party to have a campaigning chief executive, because we are a campaigning party. That's how we win. And so, to see you all leading from the front, I think members know to take something seriously when they see the leader and the president and the chief executive all out on the ground day in, day out. Ed?
Well, Mike taught me something about campaigning. And one of the ways he managed to charm people in some of the villages of Cheshire and Amersham was by giving them gardening tips. So I don't know whether that's going to catch on, and whether Dave McCobb and the field campaign team are going to be recommending that. But one thing I thought was so strong from the field campaign teamwork and all the volunteers from across the country coming to help was, we were so focused on the issues that voters were worried about. So in Cheshire and Amersham, we picked up really soon from voters, not from ourselves, but from voters, that they worried about planning. They were that they were not going to get a voice, that the Tories were taking their rights away from them and taking them for granted. And so we talked about planning and gave them our alternatives, and that really resonated. And then we got to other issues, but planning was the sort of the way in. That was what was on voters' minds. And then in North Shropshire, it was ambulance waiting times. The first time I canvassed, I think it was every third door. People were saying, I or my relative or my friend or my neighbour had to wait hours for an ambulance. And so we made the health service the core of our campaign. And, there's a lesson in that, isn't there? That if we listen to voters, we find what's their concern and then give them the Liberal Democrat solution to their problems, actually people go and vote for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So just kind of building on the results from both Cheshire and Amersham and also North Shropshire, which we know we're good at by-elections. And this is one of the reasons that I love being a Lib Dem, is because we work as a team. And it's so fantastic to see, every activist from all around the country, pouring into that by-election seats to get us a really amazing result. So there've been some concerns raised about scalability. How do we replicate that success in the general election, where both financial resources, but more importantly, people power, are thinner on the ground? I'm going to come to Mark first, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think the key element is that we absolutely can achieve the scale of campaign in a constituency, a general election, that we do at the full-on by-elections, but you need a longer period of time. So you can definitely do as much canvassing, deliver as much literature, address as much direct mail, put up as many posters, but you have to do it over a longer period of time. So I think the key to scalability is to be committing to being full-on campaigning over a longer period of time in sort of key seats. And that's where things like getting our selections in place is so important. It's where, as Ed mentioned, the investment in the field team, so that there is the professional staff support for the volunteers and the candidates all the way through that period and so on, is really important. And I guess the final element I would add, which is the tricky balance, is we need to be self-confident enough about what we can achieve, such that, we didn't just look at North Shropshire and think 10% third, leave, no way. But we also need to learn the lesson of the over-optimism of 2019. So it needs to be really driven by what's the evidence about where we can win. But absolutely, anyone listening to this, if you're in a seat that you think we've got a chance of winning at the next election, you absolutely, lots of your colleagues have managed to do a North Shropshire scale campaign over a longer period of time. And absolutely, if you get things right in your own patch, I'm absolutely sure people can do it in their own patch too next time round as well.
Mike, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, one of the things that was nice about by-elections is that you learn a load of skills from going out canvassing with people that you haven't canvassed with before. You learn different techniques. You watch how people talk to each other. And I think one great thing about both Chesham and Amersham and North Shropshire was so many people came to their first by-election and have taken stuff back to their own constituencies or their own council seats or their own places and said, look, we can apply this thing here. And I think what was very striking about both of those wins is that they weren't rocket science. It was based on talking to people on the doorstep and listening to what they said and saying, we'll try and sort that thing out that you care about. I think we ran a really good local media campaign. So the relationship with the Shropshire Star was brilliant. We did a lot of good digital stuff. And I'm really proud of the kind of the content we produced in digital. But both of those were won from knocking on doors and talking to people. And I think the single strongest thing if people take anything from that campaign, it is if you build a local team that is capable of delivering a lot of leaflets that are relevant to people and listening to people on the doorstep, you can win in really surprising places. And it's all about building that local team. And what we've tried to do with HQ or the federal party is to put in place the resources that help you build that local team and get that local team right, because that's just how we win. We know that.
Yeah, absolutely. Ed, I'm going to ask you to answer, but I'm going to add an extra question in for you as well, which is, I'd like a number from you. How many seats will we target at the next general election? I think everyone would agree that we over-targeted last time. I was a candidate in one of those seats that I think really someone looked at the wrong spreadsheet when they added my seat to the target seat list. But do we go fewer? Do we focus our efforts? Are we happy with 2025? Because obviously that puts a cap on the number you're potentially going to win. Give me an answer and give me a figure, Ed.
Well, I'm not going to because there's so many variables, the politics, how local parties build the team that Mark and Mike talked about. So I think that's still to be settled. But we do need to have target seats, and we do need the discipline in the party to recognise that we're not going to win everywhere. And if you're not a target seat, we need you to be part of the team, the national team, to win those target seats, so that when you are asked, could you please go to your neighbouring constituency or maybe travel a little while to a target seat, we need you to do that, because we just can't over target. But I do want to underpin what both Mike and Mark said. It is all about building those local teams, making those links to neighbouring local parties. We won't win seats through digital campaigning and in the media, vital both those are. The really big lesson from Cheshire and Amersham and North Shropshire is knocking on doors and delivering leaflets. Some people think that is old-fashioned. Let me tell you, President Obama, in his second re-election, we had lots of people in his team. And the quid pro quo was they taught us about what was the most effective way of winning someone's vote. And the Americans, in the way that only the Americans can do, was they tested every single thing from Twitter to paid TV ads, all of it. The most powerful thing you can do, according to Obama's special team, was knock on the door and talk to someone. So the more people who are trained in canvassing, trained in minivan, which I love, all that, who are willing to go and talk to people on the doorstep, the more seats will win. And I literally mean that. The more you recruit deliverers to deliver those leaflets, the more canvassers you get trained in everything there is about canvassing in your local party, in constituencies to support your local party's target seat, the more we're going to win. It's a very, very simple formula. And I remember winning back in 1997 by just 56 votes after 3 recounts. We won because between 9:30 p.m. and 10 p.m., we had about 100 people knocking on doors, dragging our voters to the polling stations. So it's about creating a big local team, and then you can win.
I saw that Mike just popped his hand up wanting to come in, and then I'll come to you, Mark. So Mike first.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the thing you said about us targeting the wrong places. So we clearly got a lot of things wrong in 2019. And I think one of the things that we got most wrong was we destroyed a lot of trust across the party in decision making and people's ability to say, I believe what I'm being told. And so we've worked hard on that over the last 18 months. And I hope that in both Chesham and Amersham and in North Shropshire, you've seen communications come out from the federal party and from me and others saying, as much as we can, this is where we are, and trying to give you the same data that we are using to make decisions so that you can see, do we think this is winnable or not? How much difference will it make if I come? I think by sharing that information and trying to be as open as we can across the party with what we're doing, we have rebuilt quite a lot of that trust, so people can see that the federal party is, making decisions that are sensible. I mean, it's definitely helped that we've won in both cases, but we have also tried to be real with you about where we are. And I think as we go into both the locals this year and a general election beyond that, having that sense of trust and this sense of openness from us about what we can share is going to be really important, because as Ed says, we need people to go from one place to another if something's close to win a seat. And if we can't get that right in the last few days, then we'll win far fewer seats. So just trying to rebuild that and be open and share is really important. I think a lot of you will have seen an email from Dave McCobb, which is probably the longest and most in-depth thing we've sent for a really long time about how we did this campaign and how we won. And that was absolutely deliberate. And we think the risk of that being shared outside the party is lower than the risk of people inside the party feeling they're not taken seriously and trusted, which is why we're being much more open than we have been for a long time.
Yeah, and I think, because let's remember, Chesham and Amersham and North Shropshire have not been the only by-elections this year. We've also had Batley and Spen and Hartlepool as well. And I think that, the communications that have come out of the party, the hype was around the by-elections that we won. And we're not going to get into whether we were right to stand candidates, because obviously the answer is yes. But those other by-elections have happened without that same level of hype around them. And of course, old Bexley and Sidcup as well. That was the other one. Where we've stood candidates and they've done a great shift, great service for the party. But I think we've directed our resources to where the success was. Rightly, Mark, did you just want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just echo what Mike was saying. I think one of my unhappiest experiences campaigning for the party was in a parliamentary by-election a few years back, where I was out delivering the classic final weekend tabloid newspaper and the big banner front page headline about Lib Dems set to win, and thinking that surely there's no way this is true. But okay, I don't know the numbers. I've turned up to help. I will do my stuff. And of course, when the result came out and we were a distant third, it was clear that even the people who had put that newspaper together had not really believed that it was true. And I think, if you're a small outsider party like we are, you've got, you are fueled by optimism and hope. But there's definitely a difference between being fueled by that and being self-deluded by that. And I think that's a really important thing to get right. And I hope that, for example, when members have seen where Ed or Mike or myself or others in the party, where we've gone to campaign, and in a sense also where we've therefore not gone to campaign, that we're all trying really hard to be as honest and open as it is possible, given the public nature of politics, with people about realistically what our chances are, and therefore where it's really worth people putting their own volunteer effort in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so just taking that forwards, I've got a couple of sort of, as we've not got a number, let's have a little bit of think about kind of where and who. Okay, so you're gonna all enjoy this one. This is not my question. Someone else submitted it. What is our message in Labour-facing areas? So attacking the blue wall makes absolute sense. It's very obvious to me as someone in a primarily Labour-facing area. The red wall's a bit crumbly these days. But where does this target on the sort of Tory-facing areas leave those of us who campaign in big Labour-dominated cities, particularly in the north of England? Where does that leave us? Does anyone have a thought on that?
Well, yeah, clearly. I mean, there's no doubt that the vast majority of our target seats are battles with the Conservatives, which is the whole blue wall feature, and what we've seen. But you will have Labour councils in particular who are doing a really poor job. I mean, you've shown, Hannah, amazing campaigning success in Barnsley. And are you now the official leader of the opposition? I think you are, aren't you?
Yes, I am. I am the official leader of the opposition on Barnsley Council.
Yeah, that's a fantastic achievement. And you're doing that through exposing the failures and faults of the local Labour Council. And we're doing it in many areas. I mean, doing a fantastic job in places like Sheffield and Sunderland and many other places. So Liberal Democrat campaigners on the ground fighting Labour are not flinching from putting forward the Liberal Democrat message. We are the community politicians par excellence. And that's again what we showed in the by-elections against the Conservatives. People want to know that the politician who's on their doorstep is listening to them, is hearing their concerns, is going to do something about it. And that is a critical part of winning that vote. And then once you got that influence, once you're elected as a councillor or an MP and you've got control of the council, whatever it may be, then you're able to put our Liberal Democrat ideas into practice as community politicians, reflecting the views of the people, but with that liberal message and that liberal underlying principle. So I see no problem with our activists in areas where Labour are strong, taking the fight to them.
Yeah. Mike.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think a lot of it depends on what Labour's position is on electoral reform. So I think if Labour are clearly committed to electoral reform, I think we will honestly find it quite hard to motivate our volunteers and activists in a lot of Labour-facing seats, because they'll think that's the thing I want most. That's the thing that would change stuff. I'm going to go and try and help defeat the Tories in X place. So I recently went to Cambridge's AGM. Cambridge Labour-facing. That's a stretch to try and do well in there. But South Cams, very, very close. A lot of our activists in Cambridge in the general election next general election will just go to South Cams. I think that's really clear. So a lot of it depends on that. And then the other thing is, what we saw in North Shropshire was a party that had put in place really good infrastructure, and that infrastructure, mapping all the walks, getting the volunteers in the right place, meant that when an opportunity did come up, actually they could do really, really well. And I think it's at some point there will be a Labour government, and at that point we need to have the infrastructure in place in those seats, because they come into play in a really different way as soon as Labour are in government, and it does take a long time to put that in place. So it is really important that we build teams in those places, that we get the walks out, that we keep the Liberal Democrats campaigning in those areas, and play the long game, because, it's not like politics is going to stop in 15, 20 years.
No, absolutely. And no one asked me today, but that's my answer as someone who fights Labour on a daily basis. We might be struggling to beat them at parliamentary level at the moment. There's no point pretending otherwise, but we keep fighting, keep campaigning, keep winning councillors from them, keep winning councils from them. We've got places like Hull and Sheffield where we're looking to take control of those councils. And what that does is it sets us up and builds that infrastructure at local government level for when the tide shifts, which it will in the fullness of time. We've got that base of winning that might make people think, well, actually, I've liked having a Lib Dem run council. I've liked having a Lib Dem councillor. Go on, I'll have a Lib Dem MP. Mark, any comments, particularly on how close Labour are getting to committing to electoral reform?
Yeah, I mean, electoral reform is the huge game changer for British politics and massively important to achieve. I think sort of through slightly gritted teeth, we have to acknowledge that Labour MPs in the House of Commons are probably the real key determinant, that the better we do at the next election, the more chance we've got of putting pressure on Labour, but Labour's position is absolutely crucial. But I think, therefore, it's worth thinking about the long term as well, which is that it's always easier to campaign against whoever's in power, and it's easier to get media attention if you're campaigning against who's in power. I mean, who cares that much about what one opposition party is saying about another opposition party? Those in those parties might care a lot, but for the media and for the voters, that's never as interesting. So it's obviously a little bit different in Wales, where Labour is in power in the devolved administration there. But in Scotland and in England, it's just going to be easier for us to make progress against the Tories or the SNP because we've got that basic dynamic. But what's crucial is that in the interim, as you say, Hannah, we make as much progress as we can in council elections in places like Barnsley and Rotherham and Wakefield and Sunderland, so that when there is no longer a Tory Prime Minister, we're able to continue our progress. And there's just, a natural phase of whoever's in power, that's the one it's easiest to take seats against. But we need to carry on the grassroots recovery across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so just to flip to something slightly different, and I'm going to kind of link these two questions together because we're getting a little bit short of time. So now that we're out of the EU, how do we position ourselves now, and how do we show potential voters that we have other policies worth voting for? Because obviously for a long time, our big message was around stopping Brexit. I would argue we've done better this year since that's no longer at the forefront of people's minds. But how do we position ourselves? And then linked to that is that someone said it's brilliant that we're being touted as a party to take Conservative seats, but how do we become aspirational rather than just a protest vote? So, how are we positioning ourselves as a party that people actively want to vote for? Ed?
Well, I started off talking about campaigning in Cheshire, Hampshire and North Shropshire by saying that we were listening to people and we responded to their concerns. And that's what we've been doing for quite a long time now, doing a lot of market research, listening to people, and making sure we've understood what people are feeling. And it's really clear to me that people feel that the deal between government and the people is broken under the Tories. The sort of social contract that people have expected for decades has been weakening over time, but it's been absolutely broken by the Conservatives. So that's why I've been speaking with the Autumn Conference speech and elsewhere about the need to fight for a new, fairer deal that we can offer people. And what I've said is that if there's lots of people who play by the rules, who do their bit, and I think we need to be the party that says, you deserve a fair deal, whether it's getting a decent home in a safe neighborhood, making sure your children can go to a good school and have the real opportunity to fulfill their potential, to make sure that if someone in your family is ill or disabled, you get the care, the health and social care that you need. And I want us to take on this concept of a broken social contract, the need for a fairer deal, to another level. I will be publishing a book which I'll be editing in time for the spring conference. It brings together some fresh thinkers from across the party to propose ideas on how we address this issue. There's going to be stuff on the economy, on social policy, on the environment, and on political reform. And that liberal message, whether it's on electoral reform that Mike and Mark were talking about, or about making sure that we empower people more, I think is going to be something that we can really campaign on at local and national level. Let me end on this sort of how we get our message across, who we are. I've always defined my liberalism as being someone who wanted to empower everybody, give people more power, and also at the same time hold the really powerful to account. That's what liberalism is to me. It's sharing power to people who are less powerful and holding the powerful corporations, the city, fossil fuel companies, governments to account on behalf of people. And I think that's what Liberals fundamentally believe. They want to empower everybody in our communities and in families across the country. And we need to be able to then articulate that philosophy in this fair deal approach that I'm talking about. And I think education is critical to that. I think health and care is critical to that. And I think making sure people's jobs and businesses are critical to that too.
Lovely, thanks, Ed. Mark, do you have any comments on that, or?
Yeah, maybe just coming back to the Europe bit specifically, I think, our position, our policy is very clear that in the long term, we believe that Britain's place is in the European Union. That is what will give people the best opportunities in their lives. It's what will be best for the economy. It's what will be best for battling to protect the environment. And it's the right, it's the right outcome to aim for. The question is, how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? And in that, I think we can learn a lesson from the Eurosceptics and the Brexiteers, that if you look at what they were doing in the run up to their tragically their success in the Brexit referendum, for most of that time, they were not directly campaigning for Britain to leave the EU. They picked intermediate objectives to campaign for. And I think, in reverse, we can learn a lesson from that. I think there is even many people who voted Remain don't want to hear a political party going on about Remain is the most important thing, we must rejoin tomorrow. Partly because of views about, well, maybe we should respect previous decisions, partly because there are things like COVID immediately on their mind. So even among Remainers, you lose support if you take that line. But there absolutely are areas of closer cooperation, closer alignment with the EU that we can campaign for month in, month out, and that help build that long-term vision of us getting back into the EU and making sure that we stay there as well.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so we're sort of coming towards the end of our time. So I've just got a few kind of quicker fire questions for people, please, if that's okay. What was the biggest mistake you made in 2021, and what have you learned from it?
Ooh.
Ed looks least stressed at this question, so we'll ask him first.
Oh God. Well, I think the more you listen to Dave McCobb, the better. So if I failed to listen to Dave McCobb, the head of our campaigns, then I made a mistake. We've really got to make sure that in all our campaigning for the party, we trust these amazing campaign people we've got in place, and we work with them. And I like to think we did, but I just want to underline how important it is going forward that we put our trust in these people who are really experienced, and listen to them and get ourselves trained up. And certainly I failed to do that. I made a mistake.
That's great. Thank you. Mark?
I think the biggest mistake was there was a horrible cock up over some of the party business stuff at Spring Conference related to the complaints process. And, the buck stops with me on that, because I both got my words wrong when speaking to conference and hadn't done a final check of the paperwork to spot that there was a problem, either before it was submitted or well in advance of conference. So yeah, I screwed up on that. And I think the thing I learned from it was, in a sense, what I relearned from it, because I'd sort of known this before, but it was brought home very starkly to me, was if you're in that situation, don't, just fess up, admit that you've wrong. Don't spend time trying to place the blame on anyone else, whatever. If you directly say, look, I could have done something different, I should have done something different, and I'm really sorry for that. Actually, people do respond much better. But also crucially, it then allows you to get on to, okay, how are we going to fix this? How are we going to put it right? As opposed to everyone being caught in, endless mutual recrimination. So don't screw up, but if you do screw up, take responsibility and apologize.
Yeah, good honest answer there, Mark. Thank you. I think a lot of people will appreciate that. Mike, what about you?
I make loads of mistakes all the time, every day. And I'm just trying to sort of sift through the best ones. I think the sort of crucial thing when you're trying to run an organization is to be very open about taking criticism and making sure that people feel they can challenge you on things continually. So I try quite hard to go, this is what I'm thinking, does that feel right? And to make a lot of small mistakes that are then correctable quite quickly, rather than things that kind of linger. I think something that stands in the mind particularly is during the May campaign, I gave some advice about COVID restrictions that didn't apply in Scotland in the same way it did in England, and that caused a couple of people some problems, and I didn't get to that quickly enough. So it's things like that. It's mainly telling people things in the wrong order is the thing I get wrong, because we're quite complicated and that's quite easy to do.
Yeah, lovely, good, honest reflections there. If you could have just one of the following, just one, I'm going to make you choose. Which one would you pick and why? So your choice is double the members, double the MPs, or double the donations. Mike, I'm going to come straight back to you. Don't overthink it.
Double the active members without a doubt, because it leads to all the other ones. No question.
Great stuff. Ed?
Well, I lead the parliamentary party, so if I didn't want to double the MPs, the only thing I'd say, I want to do more than that.
Very good. Ambitious. Mark?
Well, I think for completeness, I should say double the donors, because if you double the donors, you've then got the money that can get you out recruiting more members and out getting more MPs. Of course, in a way, you need all three. And if I really had to pick one, I would pick double the members. But if that's already gone, double the donors is an okay substitute.
I mean, it's a trick question, isn't it? We obviously all want all of them. And then a fun one to end on. What is the one thing you find the weirdest or most annoying about the party?
We're only allowed one. Oh my god.
I mean, Ed's got a hard deadline in 8 minutes, but feel free to list them. Ed.
All right, I'm going to be really controversial. Sometimes we think we're more a think tank than a party. And to represent the people we want to represent, we have to make sure that we're listening to them and not to ourselves. And the party doesn't always do this, but sometimes I think we forget that we're there to win elections so we can put into practice our values and our policies. And I'm not talking about making compromises. I'm just talking about what should be the priority. And I think that we are changing this. Mark's doing a lot, Mike's doing a lot, everyone's doing a lot, I think. ALDC, for example, is doing a lot to make sure we are focused in on how we get our messages, our policies, as voter focused as possible and make them the priority for us. And I think for me, when the party doesn't remember that and looks inward and talks to ourselves rather than to the voters, then that's what irritates me the most. But I have to say, I think that is changing a lot from recent past.
Yeah, here at the podcast, we definitely value winning over ideological purity, Ed. So hopefully you're preaching to the converted here. Mike?
So the single weirdest thing was that I was interviewed by more than 60 people for this job, which definitely I haven't ever had for any other chief exec job I've had. I think the kind of bigger scale thing is we know exactly how to win and we are actually very good at it, but we spend quite a lot of time doing other stuff, and that just feels really weird. So one of the things that I'm most proud of doing this year is for people that do I think it's the 10% of people that do most canvassing, we get them on a call with the leader, with our director of comms and our director of campaigns and the person that chairs our campaigns committee. And we say, A, thank you. And B, what did you hear from people? What's working? What isn't working? And we send them a pin badge to say thanks. And just that one call, partly because you get direct access to the leader, partly because you can see a lot of other people doing it, and partly because it really celebrates one important thing that we do that really helps us win, is important. So I think if I could change one thing about the party, it would be to make more of the incentive kind of structures in the party point towards and encourage the things that help us win rather than things that don't help us win. And I think that isn't set up in the way that you wouldn't, if you're running an organization, you wouldn't design the incentive structures in the way that we currently have them.
A Lib Dem bonus scheme. I like the idea of that. But of course, winning the elections is the reward that all of us want, really. Mark, what about you?
So I guess the weirdest thing is that in party committee meetings, the people who are often keenest on knocking down any new idea or opposing any proposal for change are also often the people who in policy debates at conference are most demanding that we're radical. And there is this curious, weird, lovable, endearing, whatever words you want to pick, strain of deeply small c conservative, capital R radical colleagues in the party who are really passionate about wanting to radically change society, wanting to radically make life better for people. But if you dare suggest moving even a comma in something, they'll immediately give you 38 reasons why that's an awful thing and you must never do. And it's a really weird contrast that I sort of recognize and I understand in my head, but I must admit in my gut, I still don't quite understand. So anyone listening to this who feels that I've described them, please tweet at me to explain how those two go together.
That's splendid. I think that's a really good question to end on. We're obviously coming close to time anyway. So I just want to say a massive thank you to Mark, Ed and Mike for joining us on the podcast today. We did have this one in the diary for December, but we were all busy with a little by-election. So we pushed it to January. Thank you to all our viewers for listening to us here on the podcast, and Happy New Year.
Absolutely. And thank you to Hannah and John and the team. The podcast is a great bit of the internal comms that happens in the party these days.